Hello, and welcome to this recorded sermon from the Ipswich Methodist Circuit. My name is Steve Mann. I'm a minister in the circuit serving the churches of Capel St Mary, Elmset, Bramford, Holbrook, Chelmerdiston, and Brantham. And whoever you are, wherever you're watching this from, you're very, very welcome. I was preaching recently on the story, at least the beginning of the story, of Joseph in the book of Genesis in the Old Testament. Genesis 37 is where his story begins. And I thought for this sermon I would have a look at the next installment of his story, which is Genesis 39. It's something else comes up in Genesis 38. What I wasn't prepared for, though, is how similar those two chapters are, and that the same kind of things keep recurring. So, just to remind you about chapter 37, it's a chapter that has Joseph's, well, first of all, his amazing Technicolor dream coat, the coat of many colors that his father gave to him as one indication that he was the favored child. He was the child that Jacob loved more than any of Joseph's other brothers. And as a result of that favoritism, it says that the brothers hated him. Then there were the dreams that Joseph had. Dreams where, if you remember, there were sheaves of corn bowing down that represented Joseph's brothers, and 11 stars and the sun and moon bowing down to Joseph, again indicating his brothers and his mother and father. And it says as a result of this that his brothers hated him all the more. Their grievance was even stronger. And then, of course, you get to the end of that first part of the story where the brothers see him coming when they're out in the, well, wherever it is that you graze your sheep. And they plot to kill him, first of all. In the end, they merely sell him to merchants who sell him into slavery in Egypt. That's chapter 37. But as I say, the same kind of things recur again in chapter 39. First of all, and I'm going to look at a three-point approach for the sermon today. So this is the first one, the similarities between those two chapters, those two parts of Joseph's story. But both begin with an indication of God's blessing upon Joseph and the fact that this is part of God's larger story. There are the dreams that Joseph has. That's what indicates it to us in the first part. And then the second part, it's there writ large for all to see that God blessed Joseph. And not only Joseph, but blessed Potiphar, the master that he had, and Potiphar's family, and his household, and his whole operations. God blessed Joseph. And then what comes after that? We have the reason for grievance. We saw very clearly in chapter 37 why the brothers were aggrieved with Joseph. But after that, in chapter 39, we find that Potiphar's wife has a grievance against him because he will not sleep with her. And Joseph makes it very clear that this is an ethical stand that he is taking, that to do so would to jump into bed with her would be to betray, first of all, his master Potiphar, who's put his trust in Joseph, but also to, he says, would be to sin against God. And so it says that Potiphar's wife had a grievance against him, and that leads to the second false report that we see. Remember back in Genesis 37, the brothers sell Joseph into slavery, but then take a false report back to Jacob, pretending, having taken his cloak, his wonderful cloak of many colors, and daubed it in animal blood, they take it back to Jacob as evidence, false evidence, but evidence supposedly that he's been mauled to death, torn to pieces by a wild animal. And then again, Joseph's cloak makes another appearance in the second false report, with Potiphar's wife having grabbed it as Joseph scarpered rather than give way to her sexual advances, now she produces that evidence in justification of her false report that that Joseph was the one, not her making the advances towards Joseph, but Joseph was the sexual predator himself. Interesting that the cloak is center stage in both of those false reports. And then again, at the end of each story, Joseph has his liberty taken away from him. At the end of the first part, at the end of chapter 37, he's sold into slavery. Now he's thrown into the king's prison. So, if the first part of the sermon is just to look at those similarities between the two stories, the second part is to look very briefly at six things which are underlying this part of the story that we've been looking at, chapter 39. And the first of those won't be too hard to spot, and that's the family jealousies, resentments, bitterness, rivalries that lead to Joseph, well, lead to the brothers thinking that they could even kill Joseph. They're that angry, but selling him into slavery. And sadly, I suspect that you won't need any great prompting from me to know that those things are still center stage in our world today. That in your family, almost certainly in families that you know, there have been jealousies and rivalries and resentment and bitterness and often favoritism or perceived favoritism where somebody is favored or thinks or other people think that they're favored by the parents and the roots of bitterness that can take hold as a result of that. Secondly, sadly, we still have slavery as well. We think maybe that slavery disappeared with, well, certainly the ancient times and disappeared in America in the 1800s. But in reality, slavery is still alive and well and living in our world. It's estimated that in our world today, on any given day, there are up to 30 million people who are in conditions of modern slavery. And if you include forced marriages, then that figure goes up to 50 million or so. And it's estimated that even within the UK, 130,000 people are living in conditions that would be described as slavery. It's sufficiently widespread as a problem that it even made it into the storylines of the Archers a few years ago, for anyone who remembers that. Thirdly, in the story, we have the misuse of power. Potiphar's wife, as his wife, assumes that in her position of power and authority within the household, she has the right to do whatever she chooses to the slaves. And if that means sleeping with Joseph, then she presumes that she has the right to do that until he resists her. Now, it might not be that people are in positions of slavery today, but how often today do people misuse the authority that they have over people? And people find themselves suffering as a result. I'm sure we probably all know someone, and I can think of someone very close to me who suffered greatly from the abuse of power, the misuse of authority by someone who was in management over them. Fourthly, we can list the destructive power of sexual desire. Sex is intended for good in the right channels. It's a wonderful gift from God, but when not pursued in the right channels, as we see it attempting to be pursued here, it can be destructive. And the fallout is not just in relationships or marriages. The fallout is for children caught up in family separation. And even in this particular case, had Joseph given way to the temptation that was put before him, it would have led to the breakup of that blessed, if you like, dynamic, the household that we were told was blessed because of Joseph's presence within it. All of that would have been under threat, and indeed was under threat because of Potiphar's wife's advances. Number five is racism. Did you notice how quickly the race card came out when Potiphar was trying to get people onto her side and to believe her accusations against Joseph? She didn't just say that Joseph attempted to sleep with her. She didn't just say that Joseph the slave was the one at fault. She said, if you noticed, the Hebrew slave. She brought his ethnicity into it because in that environment he was the other. And then finally, number six, we can list persecution of people for their faith or beliefs. Now, it's true that Joseph wasn't, in this particular case, victimized for his religious beliefs so much as the fact that he took that ethical stand and Potiphar's wife didn't like it. But so many Christians and people of other faith and belief around the world have a daily choice as to whether to compromise in what they feel is right in the way that they're asked to live out their lives. And many choose, like Joseph did, to say, no, that's a step too far for me. And many do so knowing that that can lead to false accusations. And we've had so many instances of people accusing people of blasphemy in Muslim or Hindu countries, or can lead to imprisonment by repressive regimes just for standing up for what you believe is the right way to live your life. Six things that underlie this story. And let me just share screen with you in a moment because I just want to share something that has come our way. You won't need me to tell you that this has been a very, very hot summer, and the ground has dried out and hardened. And as that's happened around the country, archaeological discoveries have been made. Aerial photography has revealed the outline of things that were previously unseen and hidden. And just such a thing has happened in our garden. As the ground has dried out, this mysterious structure has come to view that we never dreamt was underneath the grass. Now, before you get all excited, I have to say that I don't think it is a find of historical significance so much as a discarded concrete plug for a rotary clothes dryer. That's what my suspicion is. But all of these things that we've been talking about, family resentment, slavery, the abuse of power, sexual temptation, racism, and whatever the last one was, religious persecution and persecution of people for their beliefs. All of these, just below the surface of life and can very easily come to the surface when things heat up in the wrong kind of way. But we need to, and so we need to pray that, and if you're following the order of service that goes with this sermon, we will pray for people who are, first of all, victims of any of these things, but also pray that people may be protected for them rather than becoming victims. That's certainly what we would prefer. But the third point really seeks to redress the balance a little bit. We've been talking about some very negative things, and certainly these were very miserable points at the end of each of the stories in Joseph's life. And he must have wondered at times where God was. God seemed to be there, and then God wasn't, and then God seemed to be back, and he was being blessed, and then God wasn't. But the third point that I want to say very, very briefly in finishing is that God always was there. Whether or not Joseph felt that or not, God always was there. And if we take a step back and look at the entire story that leads right through to Egypt and Joseph becoming Pharaoh's second in command, and it says that lots of people were saved as a result of Joseph's actions. As we look at the big picture, we can see God's hand upon it. And then we can see that each of these stories, and it's one last thing that they both have in common. Each part of this story is a link in that chain that takes Joseph from that sort of small family setting in Canaan through to Egypt, where he will eventually become Pharaoh's second in command. Each of these takes him one step closer to where God wants him to be. There may have been times of pain that Joseph had to go through, but God's hand was always upon his situation and his journey. And it may be for you today that you can empathize with Joseph because it feels like you're going through a miserable time, or maybe you have been through a miserable time in the past, or you will go through a miserable time in the future. Most of us do. And it may be that we can, like Joseph, look back, and Joseph looks back in chapter 50, and he says, "What was intended for harm, what should have been there to harm me, God intended for good." God's hand was upon things. Now, maybe you can look back, or will be able to look back in the future and see the preciseness of your fitting into God's plans and God's hand being upon your journey. But I can't promise you that. But what I can promise you is that God will never desert you. God will always be there with you. And that God intends not misery for you, but blessing. And finally, that God can bring out of even the direst of situations good and positive things. I pray that that may get you through what you're going through now, or if it's any point in the future, any of us are going through those times of misery, that we may remember that and look to what God may be doing in our situation. I pray that God will be with you and God will bless you until we meet again.